A man was violated by a fox spirit in his dream. The next day, a strange fox head appeared on his back. From that day on, he constantly cried out in pain, claiming that something was gnawing at his flesh, trying to consume him. My mother, Mary, rushed my father, John, to the hospital, but the doctors found nothing wrong. In the end, John was so desperate that he begged Mary to peel the skin off his back. Mary realized that the fox head wasn't ordinary and consulted my grandparents, Robert and Helen, about finding a spiritual healer. However, it was too late. The fox head suddenly opened its mouth and John locked himself in his room, screaming in agony. When Robert kicked the door down, John had already turned into a pile of bones. The whole town of Greenfield was in an uproar. It was said that the Johnson family's past misdeeds were finally catching up with them. Helen cried angrily at Robert, hitting him and blaming him for causing John's death. When I asked Mary why they said Robert had done something wrong, Mary just cried, not saying whether she didn't know or didn't want to tell me. Helen lay in bed all day, crying and muttering that the curse had come, her son was dead, and next it would be her grandson, ending the Johnson family line. One day, Robert suddenly threw down the cigarette he was smoking and stomped on it, gritting his teeth. "No way am I letting this family die out," he said, storming out the door, never to return. Everyone said Robert died somewhere out there. Helen and Mary thought the same, and I was terrified that I too would end up with a fox head on my back and turn into a pile of bones. But luckily, years passed, and I lived well, even getting into college. The fear slowly subsided. But no one expected that in my junior year, Robert, who had been missing for 15 years, suddenly returned. But the Robert who came back was like a different person. Gaunt, lifeless, like a candle burning out. A few days later, Robert was on his deathbed. I rushed home from school to see him one last time. With his last ounce of strength, Robert grabbed my hand and gave me 3 instructions. First, he told me to drop out of school. Second, he wanted me to marry Sarah within 7 days. And third, he gave me an address and told me to find someone named Joe Smith there. These 3 things seemed simple, but each one could change my fate. For a kid from a small town, getting into college was the only way to change my life. But now Robert wanted me to drop out. Sarah was a mentally unstable woman in our town, someone who had been out of her mind for over 30 years. And now Robert wanted me to marry her. As for Joe Smith, I had no idea who that was. Robert's funeral was quickly arranged, but I was torn. I didn't understand any of Robert's instructions. Helen, usually so gentle, suddenly slapped me hard and sternly warned me, "If you don't want to die, if you don't want the Johnson family to end, you'll do as Robert said." I agreed to drop out of school and find Joe Smith, but I refused to marry a woman who was mentally ill. Helen fell silent, and after a long pause, she sighed, "Robert committed a great sin, which is why a fox head appeared on your father's back. He died, and next it will be you. It's a curse." My heart sank, and I began to tremble at the thought of dying like my father, reduced to a pile of bones. Helen continued, "Over the years, Robert gave his life to find a way to break the curse. There's no other choice." With that, Helen walked out the door. Seeing her frail figure made me feel a pang of sorrow, and I decided to follow Robert's last wishes and find Joe Smith. To my surprise, the address led me to a tattoo parlor, its sign old and eerie. I timidly called out, "Anyone here?" Suddenly, a man appeared in front of me, tall and intimidating, with a menacing look in his eyes and a half-sharpened knife in his hand. Startled, I said, "I'm looking for Joe Smith." "That's me," he grunted, coming closer. I couldn't help but step back, afraid he might suddenly attack me. "You're the grandson of the Black Dragon," he said, circling around me. Suddenly, he slapped me hard on the back, nearly knocking me over. He laughed. I knew it. "You're the Black Dragon's grandson. Let's go." Without giving me a choice, he grabbed a wooden box from the table and pulled me outside. 2.5 hours later, we arrived at the foot of a mountain. There, in the middle of nowhere, stood an abandoned temple, its entrance covered in cobwebs and filled with eerie statues. In the center of the temple was a black statue of a human-faced fox. Joe Smith kicked me in the back, forcing me to kneel before the statue. Then he took 3 incense sticks from the wooden box, lit them, and placed them in the incense burner in front of the statue. Joe Smith knelt and bowed several times before suddenly grabbing me by the collar, lifting me up. "The Black Dragon gave you a task, and you haven't completed it," he said. "My grandfather wanted me to marry a crazy woman, but I haven't had the chance," I replied. "You didn't follow the rules, and now you're trying to get me killed?" Joe Smith kicked me to the ground again, pointing at the shattered statue. "The spirit doesn't even want to give you a chance to atone. The Black Dragon's sins were too great. 163 lives were lost. Looks like I can't help you. You're on your own." I jumped up, furious. "I'll die if I have to. Who says I need your help anyway?" Joe Smith stopped and turned, staring at me coldly. "Take a look at your back, kid." I hesitated, then quickly pulled up my shirt and looked in the mirror next to the statue. A lifelike black fox head had appeared on my back. I knew I was in deep trouble. I had always hoped my father's fate wouldn't repeat itself with me, especially since the fox head hadn't shown up in all these years. But now, here it was. Trembling, I called Helen. "Grandma, please prepare for the wedding with Sarah. I'll come home today." I returned home in a daze. Helen had everything ready, and that day, I married Sarah. The town of Greenfield was buzzing with gossip. "What's wrong with the Johnson boy? Why did he suddenly come back and marry Sarah, the crazy woman?" they whispered. "So much for his bright future. The kid's got a fox head on his back. He won't live long. And Sarah? She went mad in their house years ago, so it's only right they take responsibility." But what shocked me most was what happened on the wedding day. During the ceremony, a strange scream came from the bedroom, and I saw Sarah, dressed in her red wedding gown, run out like a madwoman. In a flash, she was up in the attic. Helen seemed to realize something and shouted, "Stop her! Don't let her go to the attic!" But it was too late. Sarah was too fast, bursting into the attic, her pupils dilating as she stared at something in the room. The next second, she let out a blood-curdling scream, as if she had seen something terrifying, and then bolted down the stairs and out of the house, disappearing into the night. Helen was frantic, and the villagers searched all night, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Helen didn't blame me. She just sighed and said, "It's fate. Even though the task isn't complete, it shouldn't be fatal. Go find Joe Smith right away. There might still be hope." Dragging my weary body, I returned to the tattoo parlor. Joe Smith seemed to know I'd be back. He was sitting at the door, looking like a devil himself. "I've completed the first 2 tasks. Now save me," I pleaded. He stared at me for a while, then turned and pulled a curtain aside with a loud clang. Beneath it was a 7 or 8 meter long pool, the water black and bubbling ominously. Joe Smith grabbed my arm and yanked me in, and I plunged into the pool, my instincts screaming to climb out. But the swirling black substance in the water enveloped me, pulling me down. Whether it was a dream or reality, I heard a woman's chilling scream in my ears. I saw a giant black fox, covered in flames, struggling and crying out as the fire consumed her. More black foxes, also on fire, appeared, their agonizing cries filling the air. I woke up with a start, finding myself lying face down on a table, my shirtless back exposed. Joe Smith stood behind me, fiddling with something on my back. "Now you know what your grandfather did, don't you?" he said coldly. I recalled the dream and blurted out, "Foxes." The infamous massacre of the fox spirits that shook both worlds. The Black Dragon was the mastermind. The most revered, discreet and life-respecting Black Fox clan, almost entirely slaughtered by your grandfather. His actions angered the entire underworld.